Hey everyone, my name is Ben. I'm a postdoc at the Center for IT Security, Privacy and Accountability, or for short CISPA, of Saarland University. And I'm really happy today to present to you joint work with my co-authors Giancarlo, Christian, Martin, and Michael on the feasibility of web vulnerability notifications. So the motivation for our work is somewhat twofold. So on the one hand side, previous years have shown that widely used content management systems such as, for example, Drupal or Joomla have had really critical vulnerabilities which were exploited at scale within a number of hours. On the other side, the research community, including actually ourselves as well as Adam, doing the execute after redirect flaws, have discovered ways of finding these vulnerabilities or finding different types of vulnerabilities at scale in web applications. However, while we as a community have become really good at finding these bugs, we have not really focused that much on notifying the affected parties about the problem. And this is exactly where our work wants to come in and try to understand how notifications can work at scale and have a look at what potentially suitable communication channels might be to do this at scale, how such a campaign can influence the prevalence of vulnerabilities on the web, and if it doesn't work, try to also find out what inhibiting factors might be. So to answer this question, we set up a study. For the study, we used two types of vulnerabilities. So on the one hand side, we used vulnerabilities in WordPress, and we chose WordPress because it powers about 25% of the top 1 million websites, so obviously it's the most widely used content management system. Next to two cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, we selected what is called the XML RPC multi-call flaw. This is basically a vulnerability that allows an attacker in a single HTTP request to brute force a large number of username and password combinations, thereby basically bypassing any rate limiting that might be done by the server. It's important to note that in this case, well before we started our work, all these vulnerabilities had existing patches. So it wasn't that WordPress had to develop something first or there was like brand new thing, but at least like 6-month-old patches existed. In total, we found that about 44,000 domains in the Alexa top 1 million were susceptible to one of these vulnerabilities and used this as our first data set. The second data set consisted of previously unknown client-side or also DOM-based cross-site scripting vulnerabilities we discovered with a methodology we presented at CCS 3 years ago. And in contrast to the WordPress flaws, these things are site-specific. So there's no kind of one-size-fits-all solution to these bugs, but rather the developers of the website have to fix them themselves. And more importantly, obviously, there's no kind of auto-update feature for these vulnerabilities, so no existing patches are around. So in order to now try to notify the affected parties, we thought about what communication channels we could use. And first, we're talking about web here. So you can directly go to a website oftentimes, fill out a contact form, potentially even give the type of message or state the type of message that you're sending. So you're sending a security vulnerability notification. But obviously, this doesn't scale, right? Not all websites in the top 1 million have this. And even if they did, probably they would have some captcha that you cannot self automatically. So rather, we focused on using different types of email addresses, and that is on the one hand side what we call generic email aliases, which is info @ security @ webmaster @ and abuse @ that domain. And on top of that, also information we gathered from the WHOIS registry, that is either the registrant of the domain or the technical contact if there is no registrant address. So next to directly trying to talk to these people, we can also involve intermediaries. And one of the most well-studied intermediaries there is are vulnerability reward programs. So there have been papers also presented here at USENIX that really show that these work quite well for all those companies that take part in these VRP programs. However, this goes back to the same problem with the web contact forms. Not everybody is a member, and not obviously all the top 1 million sites can be reached this way. So rather what we did is we selected to notify the hosting providers, more specifically the abuse contacts, because this is the closest thing that you can get to a security contact in a hosting company, as well as what we call trusted third parties. And these are on the one hand side regional certs, such as, for example, the US cert or the German cert, as well as the umbrella cert organization, which is called FIRST. And then the Trusted Community Ops Trust, where actually one of our co-authors was a member. All right, so with these two prerequisites, let me now talk a little bit about the notification procedure. So first, we split up the data set of vulnerable domains into 5 groups of exactly equal size. That is 4 notification groups, as discussed before, as well as then 1 control group to see what would regularly go on the internet if nobody told people about the vulnerabilities. We sent out the notification via email, but in this email, we did not disclose the vulnerability in whole, but we rather said, okay, you have a vulnerability. This is the type of vulnerability. If you want to know more about this, please visit our website where we've prepared all the details on the impact, the problem, etc. And this was obviously done so that we could actually measure how long it would take people to react to our emails, or if they would react at all. Alternatively, if people didn't want to click on a link, and if you send somebody an email saying, hey, you have a cross-site scripting, please click on this link, this might sound a little fishy, we actually offered them the opportunity to also use a secret token, which was contained in the email. So they could just send us an email back, and our mailbot would actually automatically respond with a report. But again, this way we could measure the fact that they had received the email and reacted to us. While we sent 1 email per email address for the direct notification channels, sending about 9,000 emails to all the certs would have been really bad. So there we opted for an aggregated disclosure. That is, we sent them a CSV list. It's like, here are all the domains within your constituency that have vulnerabilities. Please handle it accordingly. We then sent bi-weekly emails. So the first one on January 14th, a reminder on the January 28th, and the last one then on February 11th, which coincides roughly with the deadline to a major security venue. And if people actually followed this link in our email, they would be presented with such a web interface. So on the top, we again explain who we are, what we are doing here. And then on the bottom, the administrators could see the discovered vulnerabilities for that specific domain. So we see here a type of vulnerability, in this case, DOM-based cross-site scripting, when it was last verified. This way, administrators could actually check our website to see if they were still vulnerable or they successfully patched the problem. But also, they could click here on View Report to get some more details, and would be presented with a site like this. So on top, we explain again the problem, then what the impact is, especially for maybe not security-aware WordPress users. Explaining the impact of such vulnerabilities is probably quite useful. Then a proof of concept for the cross-site scripting is just open an alert box with a domain, and then steps on remediating the vulnerability. In this case, we're looking at a vulnerability which is a client-side cross-site scripting, and I said before, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to these problems. So here we rather only give the list of files which were involved in the exploitable data flow, such that a developer can actually kind of look especially at that file and try to find out where the vulnerability is and how to fix it. For WordPress, this would basically just show information on how to update the installation. So throughout our campaign, we did a number of measurements. So on the one hand side, we did vulnerability monitoring. That is, for WordPress, we did actually 1 proof of concept test per day. For client-side cross-site scripting, we went with 1 every 3 hours. And this comes from the fact that oftentimes these client-side cross-site scripting issues are caused by third-party, for example, advertisements. And many websites have things like banner rotation. So even if you hit the same page twice, you might not get the same advertisement and therefore not the same vulnerability. So this really just allowed us to have a higher chance of at least triggering the vulnerability once per day. On top of that, we looked at the mailbox that we used to send the reports, as well as then the log files from the report interface to classify each domain into one of the following 4 states. Reached means either somebody responded to our email saying, yes, we got your message, or they viewed a report on the web interface. Bounced means all emails that we sent to that domain bounced. That is, for example, for the generic channel, all 4 email addresses didn't work. Unreachable could happen if, for example, for a given domain, there is no whois information, so there's no email address because it's not mandatory. Or also sometimes we send out emails and got automated responses back saying, please fill out this form on a website. And again, this is not something that you can do automatically at scale, so we mark these domains as unreachable. And then last but not least, any other domain where we don't have any information has to be marked as unknown. And while this is straightforward for the direct communication channels, for the indirect communication channels, we can only really measure the first step of the chain, so if we reach the intermediary or not. So as an example, if there's a domain which we disclosed to via a provider and this domain viewed a report on a web interface, we automatically mark all domains that we also disclosed to this provider as being reached, because by definition, we must have reached the intermediary because otherwise nobody could have clicked the link. All right, so with these measurements, let me now briefly talk about the global impact of our notification campaign. So on the left-hand side, we see the number of fixed sites over time for WordPress. And we see that until January 14th, which is here shown with the dotted lines, so the first notification, all these lines are more or less the same. So the control group equals kind of all the notified groups. After that, there's kind of a gap opening up between the control group and the notified groups, and this gap kind of increases a little bit over time, and more precisely also after each reminder round. The obvious question that comes to mind in this case is, why is there like a 22.5% fix rate for domains in the control group, right? We didn't tell them about the vulnerabilities. And this can be easily explained by the fact that these are WordPress installations, and there are existing patches to all the vulnerabilities. So really, you just have to update your WordPress, and people do this more or less regularly. So this is really what I would call kind of a natural evolution of the vulnerabilities that just go away over time just because people update their WordPress. In this case, the best performing group was actually the WHOIS, which is here denoted as domain contacts. But in total, we only managed to kind of help about 280 domains be fixed, because this is the number of fixed domains in the WHOIS group on top of the control group. For client-side cross-site scripting, the situation looks quite different. So here we see that the control group in the end only fixed about 2% of the vulnerabilities, and this is to be somewhat expected, right? Because we didn't tell them about it; they probably didn't know before. So this is most likely like features that were included or removed. So there's no such kind of natural decay of the vulnerabilities. Here we see that the trusted third parties actually work best with a total of 31 domains which were fixed out of 185 in that group. So it's really like just 17%. And while this is pretty obvious for the client-side cross-site scripting, also the WordPress actually showed statistically significant differences between control group and our notification campaign. So we did have, statistically speaking, a significant impact. However, and I really want to quote ourselves in the paper, from the paper here, is these. On the statistics side, it's awesome, we're significant. However, if you look at the number of fixed domains, this is really unsatisfactory, right? So we have 25.8% of the WordPress domains which we notified that fixed the vulnerability, but most of them actually due to this natural decay of the vulnerability rather than our notifications. And for client-side cross-site scripting, 12.6% again is a way too low number. And what we now wanted to find out is, why did this happen? And to answer this, we actually did an analysis of the communication channels as such. And let me, I want to go over here over a couple of kind of the highlights. For the further details and the exact numbers, please refer to the paper. So first, let's have a look at the reachability of the direct communication channels. So generic email addresses from WordPress, so this is the top 1,000,000 domains. We see that here almost 50% of all domains bounced. That means all 4 emails that we sent to that domain didn't make it. And we see kind of this teeny tiny blue part up here, which is about 3% of the domains which we managed to reach, with a large body of unknowns here in the middle, which can either be because people didn't trust the link, or what I think is more likely, there is like silent bounces. So the mail server maybe accepted the email, didn't bounce back, maybe it ended in a spam trap, I have no idea. For the client-side cross-site scripting, the situation looks a little bit different. So here we only have 30% bounces, but more importantly, we managed to reach over 20% of the domains. So this sounds more promising than for WordPress. For WHOIS, we have a different issue. So we again have a relatively low number, which is about 6% of the domains which were reached. And here we see a big chunk, about 18%, which are reachable. And this is, as I said before, caused by the fact that there is simply no WHOIS entry for that domain, or at least there is no email address in that WHOIS entry. For client-side XSS, situation looks a little bit similar. So we again have this big chunk of about 18%, but also managed to reach 20% of the domains. However, reaching a domain does not yet mean that they viewed the report. It can also mean that they just acknowledged our email, didn't do anything about it. So one factor that is actually more interesting is the number of viewed reports. And here we see that there is rarely people who acknowledge our email and then don't click. But like there's a relatively high conversion rate. Basically, if a domain is reached, they will also have viewed the domain. And I want to point your attention to actually this part here, because this accounts for 550 domains in the WHOIS group, which we could reach in terms of they viewed a domain report, right? So they knew about the vulnerability. However, only 280 were kind of fixed on top of the control group. So apparently, it's not enough to make people view the report or get them to view the report, but there must be some other factors as well. And I will come back to that in a couple of slides. For the indirect channels, we have a somewhat different scenario. So for the providers, we managed to reach over 40%. So that is 40% of those providers either viewed a report or at least acknowledged that they got the email from us. For client-side XSS, we have comparable numbers, so about 40%. In this case here, this chunk is not caused by missing domain entries, missing email entries, sorry, but rather by these automated responses saying, please fill out this web form to get in contact with us. For the trusted third parties, the situation looks much, much better. So here we managed to reach 85% of all domains, which sounds really promising. And for client-side XSS, it's about 75%. However, we again have to consider that reaching a domain is not sufficient, but rather we need them to view the report. So here the numbers are less good. In the end, we see that especially for WordPress, while there's many providers and trusted third parties we reached, they rarely kind of took the information serious and acted upon it. What we do observe is that about 40% of the domains in the client-side cross-site scripting group from trusted third parties read a report, and this actually amounts to 70 trusted third-party domains. But if you think back to the 31 domains which were only fixed in this, we again have the same issue. Viewing a report is not sufficient to have the vulnerability fixed then. So one other thing that we looked at is the time it took people to fix the vulnerability after they had viewed a report. And we see this here on the left-hand side for WordPress, where we see that within the first day, about 15%, regardless of the group, could fix the vulnerability. And we see that this curve kind of becomes less steep after a couple of days. Actually, it turns out that after day 5, this increase in the fixed domains corresponds to this natural decay of vulnerability. So it's exactly the same as in the control group. So at that point, it's no longer us. It's just this natural evolution of the vulnerability that kicked in here. For client-side XSS, we can't really see such a trend. What we can observe is that in total, it took them a little bit longer to reach the fix rates in the end. Here we see that actually the generic channel performed best with about 38% fix rate. But on average, it's about 25% of the domains that fixed the vulnerability once they had viewed the report. And basically all these factors, so reaching somebody in the first place, then having them view the report, and then from the report having been viewed to the domain being fixed, are all these factors that really cause these issues with reaching out to the affected parties. And with this, I'd really like to now kind of focus on some of the key insights that we gained and also ask a number of follow-up questions for future research. So what we saw is that establishing communication channels is quite tough. So for the direct channels, these are very hard to reach. So these generic email aliases, they perform horribly for the top 1,000,000, with 50% of them bouncing. The WHOIS information helps. So actually, WHOIS was the best channel for the WordPress installations. But there's like about 1/5 of the domains which lack an email entry. So there's no way we could reach them. And for the indirect channels, these are somewhat easier to reach, right? So there's like less of them, obviously. And what we found is that oftentimes they just don't forward the information. Turns out actually that the top 5 providers of hosting vulnerable domains didn't do a single thing. That is, they didn't vet the information, so they didn't view a report on the website, and obviously then also didn't forward the information. So this is definitely a problem that needs to be addressed by them. However, the research question that really comes out of this is, how can the security community, and I don't necessarily mean the research community, because this might not be a research problem, but rather a kind of political issue, come up with reliable means of establishing communication channels between a researcher and the affected parties to kind of allow for a smooth notification process. One other thing that we saw is that actually reminders helped quite a bit, especially for the direct communication channels. So here on the right-hand side, we see the number of domains that viewed a report at least once on a web interface over time, basically the first time they viewed the report. And again, here we see the red dotted lines, which denote the reminders. So here we see a steep improvement on these curves, as well as over here. For client-side cross-site scripting, actually, the first reminder had a bigger impact than the second one, but still, we managed to kind of still poke people enough to at least have a look at the report once. What we also found is that the report, once it was viewed, led to about 25 to 30% fix rate. But after 5 days, the fix rate for WordPress somewhat equaled that of the control group, so the effect had completely gone away. So if I were to do this exact experiment again, I would probably keep sending out emails every 5 days to poke people and say, hey, you're still vulnerable, thanks for viewing the report, but maybe you should do something about this. But the question that really comes out of this is, why was the ratio from viewing a report to getting the domain fixed not higher? And I think this is definitely interesting to determine in the future how we can improve upon this fixed ratio. Did we not put the information in understandable terms? Was it too technical? Was it not technical enough? This is really something that should be addressed by future work. Another thing is the sender reputation. So there has been previous work presented at WISE last year, and they looked at notifying websites, or actually providers of websites, about malware infections they had on their sites or for their customers. And what they tried is basically use different senders. So like a university, a random or a researcher with a real name, and some random alias. And they found that actually it didn't seem to matter who sent the information. The fix rate were equally bad. However, our work somewhat begs to differ. So we found that when we analyzed the data that we had, that the German CERT was more inclined to forward our information. And this is most likely due to the fact that actually one of our co-authors had dealings with the German CERT before, so they just knew him, they trusted him, and then forwarded the information. Also, providers were more inclined to actually act upon the notification if it came from the German CERT. There was one provider which had about 200 domains in both the provider dataset as well as the trusted third-party dataset. And those domains, which were notified via the detour over the German CERT, had about 60% view rate, whereas the ones that we disclosed directly to them had 0% view rate. So they simply discarded our message, but they believed the information from the German CERT. And even if they didn't trust us the first time, after they had gotten the same or information on the same type of vulnerabilities from the German CERT, they might have thought, yeah, well, these guys might be legitimate here. But the question that comes out of this is really, what is the impact of the sender reputation, especially when we're using such intermediaries on the effect or the success of such a notification campaign? So one thing that we needed to do, and I said this in the beginning, for our experiment was actually, we asked users to click a link or at least send us an email back with a secret token such that they could access the report. And if you think about the training that hopefully everybody gets, both at the university as well as in companies, you are trained not to do that, right? There's a fishy email that's coming in, you don't click the link. So we were well aware of this and wanted to try to determine whether this was actually an issue for our work or not. So what we did is at the end of our experiment, that is right after the submission, we notified the domains that were still vulnerable in the control group. So on the one hand side, we wanted to notify them as well because we had explicitly excluded them before, so it was the ethical thing to do. But also what we did is actually we sent them an email with the full disclosure. So we didn't send them a link or something, but like, here's the vulnerability description, this is how you can fix it, etc. And we then checked the statistical significance when comparing it to the ones that we sent with a link. And for client-side cross-site scripting, that didn't make a difference. For WordPress, it did make a difference. However, not necessarily in the way that one would expect, because actually the emails that had the full disclosure in the initial email, they performed worse than the ones with the link. So people were more inclined to fix the vulnerability if they had a link they could click on. And one potential issue here might have been the message length. So there's like a super long message, which is very technical right away. You don't have kind of a trust anchor in terms of an HTTPS certificate. So this might have all kind of factored into this issue. And the question that I would like to see answered is really, to what extent does the message tone, the message content, but also the message length influence the success of these campaigns if we were to notify people about vulnerabilities? Last but not least, it appears that the results are somewhat dependent on the application domain. So actually Frank, who's up next, and I'm just spoiling a little of your results here, found that the providers, which were really horrible on our end, worked better than the certs, so the trusted third parties. So they were just looking at different types of vulnerabilities. For them, they worked better. For us, they didn't work at all. Similarly, for Heartbleed, the number of fixes were way higher, maybe because the impact was higher of the vulnerability. This is something that needs, is up to speculation. But really, it shows that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to this notification problem. But also, interestingly, even within the same application domain, that is web application issues, we found that the results differ. So the generic channel performed really badly on WordPress, but it actually performed reasonably well for these higher-ranked client-side cross-site scripting domains. So this is definitely an interesting fact as well. So actually, out of this, I want to ask two questions. So on the one hand side, are campaigns more successful if the vulnerabilities gain media attention, such as Heartbleed or also now just recently Drown? But also, on the other hand, does it matter who needs to fix the vulnerability? So in the case of Heartbleed or Drown, it's the network admin who's probably very technically savvy. In the case of client-side cross-site scriptings, it's typically the website developer, so he hopefully is also quite savvy in JavaScript. Or is it the end user? In this case, for WordPress, it's really, you don't have to patch the vulnerability, but you just have to update your installation. All right, with this, I'd like to conclude my talk. So we conducted the first analysis of the notifications for web vulnerabilities at scale using two data sets. That is, on the one hand side, well-known WordPress flaws, as well as previously unknown client-side cross-site scripting issues. We checked out different communication channels, that is both direct and indirect, and we found that although the results show a statistically significant improvement that was caused by our campaign, and that WHOIS worked best for WordPress and the trusted third parties work best for client-side cross-site scripting, the overall improvement was very much unsatisfactory. So by the end of our experiment, about 3/4 of all domains in our data set were still vulnerable, and they probably are even today. And when trying to identify what the main issues were, we found that really the biggest problem as such is reaching the administrators in the first place. While this 30 or 25 to 30% fix rate can be improved upon, it still is a good start once we reach them in the first place. And with this, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Just gotta give them time. They'll come.
Abner Mendoza, Texas A&M. Very nice work. I was wondering, your numbers, the statistics that you showed look similar to, for example, email marketing numbers in terms of opening rates of emails. So I'm wondering if you thought about testing perhaps even the design of the email, so it has some kind of element of to persuade the users to either forward it or act upon the email itself.
Yep. So that's definitely a good point. So I didn't know that the marketing numbers are similar, but it turns out actually with a co-author, I discussed this just last week, that actually if we want to study this more, we would have to find somebody from marketing who knows how you have to talk to people, because I'm a technical guy, so I'm going to tell you technical details, but probably this might have some negative influence, obviously, on the average user who doesn't know anything about this. But this is definitely something that we want to do in future work, because it's definitely interesting to understand why people didn't click or didn't trust the emails.
Yeah, I think even just like the design of the email, so it has some kind of sense of urgency. For example, like fake AV, the fake AV with pop-ups that you get, you have to act now, so that might give you different results.
So this is basically the email that we sent. So basically we're explaining what we're doing, what the vulnerability is, here what the impact is, and then here we explain to them how they can reach us on the web interface or use this token here. And I even went as far as to add my phone number, and there's actually people who called me saying, "Is this real?" And it's like, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if the telephone channel is in this case the authenticated one. But I totally agree that there is definitely room for improvement on the emails.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for the talk. Yes, I'm Boshmaf, QCRI. I think just 2 comments about this. I think this is one of the studies where qualitative data would increase the quantitative results. Because, I mean, in the industry, 20 days is really a short time period to fix something. It's like 2 sprints, and if it's coming from outside, from non-paying customer, really they're gonna put that much lower in the priority list. So I guess 20 days is just a short time period to measure whether they're actually worked on that. So have you considered actually interviewing, talking to 2 groups, those who responded and the others who did not, and try to understand why?
Yeah, so I mean, I absolutely agree with you on the kind of qualitative investigation that we should do, because the problem in this case is we can talk to the people that responded to us, but how do we talk to the people that didn't respond to us? That's one thing that you can do, right? I think we were also discussing kind of writing them emails and calling them, saying, "Hey, did you get our message? Did you just ignore us?" I think that's definitely an interesting problem. I feel actually I only showed the graphs that we have in the paper, so with the fix rates, but we observed that actually this fix rate for the client-side XSS issues, it doesn't really get that much higher, and also the number of domains that viewed a report didn't increase over time more. So basically it stopped. So we had the effect notifying people, reminding them, so this always increased the numbers, but after that it kind of remain stable. So at this point, people did not even look at the report, because if I can only imagine if a company gets an email saying there's a vulnerability, they don't just put it on a kind of somewhere without actually looking at it first, right?
I mean, you can take a look at Apache projects, and there's a lot of such issues open and pooled.
That's a good comment. Thanks.
Great. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time. So,
okay. I just want to make one
Sure.
quick comment.
Quick.
I run an abuse desk, and if I get reports from multiple channels about the same thing, it's going to probably get binned as spam.
Yes, but you wouldn't get the same information from different channels. Right. So your domain would either
For
be...
your study, that's fine, but we encounter this all the time with somebody that's really exercised about our NTP server.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
All right, let's thank our speaker one more time.